Hello, welcome back. My name is Ari and today I have a very large stack of books over here of the books that I have read this month. So my little bit of a reading slump that I was having the past 2 months is officially over, and I read a lot in August. So how I do these wrap-ups is I'm going to quickly reference all of the books that I have read. I'm not going to give you any real details about them other than maybe like, oh, I like this, I didn't like this. And if you see a book that you're interested in my opinion on, down in the description box below, I link my particular Goodreads review of every single one of these books. So this way, this is a quick video. It's not like a 40-minute video, which it would be if I talked about every single one of these books. But you still get like a little feel, a little peck of what my opinion on these books is. But before I talk about the books, let me go through my reading stats for the month. In August, I read 24 books for a total of 10,666 pages. That was 344 pages per day on average and 444 pages per book on average. So I read a lot of books and I read some thick books, if you will. As far as authors go, 17 of the authors I read this month were female and 7 of them were male. For genres, 14 of these books were fantasy books, 5 sci-fi, 3 general fiction, 1 romance, and 1 nonfiction. For demographic, I read 17 books targeted towards adults and 7 targeted towards a young adult audience. Format, I read 22 physical books and 2 ebooks. Source, 13 of these books were backlist books that I had either received or purchased in 2020 or earlier. 5 of them came in book boxes in 2021, and 4 of them I had purchased in 2021. 1 was from Kindle Unlimited and 1 was an ARC. As far as a star rating goes, I had 4 5 stars, 4 4 stars, 13 3 stars, 2 2 stars, and 1 1 star. And 2 DNFs, 2.5 DNFs. I'll talk more about the other DNF here in a second. Before I get into talking about these books, most of these I read as a read your shelf challenge this month. So there are a lot of vlogs that I did where I picked my books off of my TBR shelves and read like one of my different 4 shelves each month. So you can get a lot more information about each one of these books in those videos, which I will link in the description box. So the first book I read this month was Lady Midnight, which is book 1 of the Dark Artifices series by Cassandra Clare. I liked this a lot. This is one of my 5 stars. Next up, I read Kingdom of Ash by Sarah J. Maas, and this is the final book in the Throne of Glass novel series, and I also loved this. This was another 5 star. So starting out strong this month with 2 back-to-back 5-star books, and they're both pretty thick. After that, I read An Easy Death by Charlene Harris. This is the first book in, I don't know what this series is called, but whatever the hell this series is, this is the first book in it. This was pretty good, but not my like favorite book of all time. But good enough that I will be continuing on with this series. Next up, after that, I read Red Seas Under Red Skies by Scott Lynch. This is the second book in the Gentleman Bastard series, and I know the 4th book in the series is coming out in November, I believe. So I've been doing a reread because the 3rd book came out in 2010. So it's been about 10 or more years since I've read this series. So I wanted to reread and catch up and refamiliarize myself with these. After that, I read Dangerous Alliance by Janiki Cohen. This is like young adult romance, like young adult historical romance. So if you like the idea of historical romance but you don't want the smut, you may like this novel. It was okay. After that, I read The Lost Puzzler by Isle Kless, I think is how you say his name. This is sci-fi, and the first book in this series that I got out of a book box. I really enjoyed this. This was good. Very entertaining story. After that, I read Red Hood by Elena Arnold. This is extremely feminist, and I think this is fantastic, but you should look up trigger warnings if you need trigger warnings about misogyny and rape culture. So, very good, highly recommend, but does come with trigger warnings. After that, I read the Borja Confessions by Alyssa Pomblano. This one is historical romance with like a religious overtone, because the Borgia family, like the head of the Borgia family, is the Pope. So you have to want to read about the papacy if you're interested in reading this. This isn't really my cup of tea, but I think a lot of people who like historical romances will like this. Next up, I read The Sin in the Steel by Ryan Van Loan. This is the book that I got this month from my Page One subscription, and I hated this. This was awful. I don't recommend. Next up, I read Grown by Tiffany D. Jackson, which I got this in my Black Lit book box, I believe is the book box that this came in. And this is a very well told story, but it is about grooming, which is not a subject that I personally care to read about. So this does come with a lot of trigger warnings, and it creeps me out, and I hated every moment I spent reading this, but I can acknowledge that this is a very well told story. After that, I read The Inheritance of Orquídea Divina by Zoraida Cordova, and this is, if you can't tell by the top of it, my book of the month pick for the month. This is like true magical realism in like the original purpose of like the category magical realism, where it is very indigenous, and the most popular book that I can think of to relate to this would be 100 Years of Solitude. It's very magically similar to that, even though the story is nothing the same. This one I liked but didn't love. So good but not great. If you're interested in the story, I do think it is worth the read. It's just not 100% what I wanted from a book, if that makes sense. But still really good. After that, I read another Hispanic book, which is The Latin Deli by Judith Ortiz Cofer. And this is a like poetry and short story and essay collection about immigrated Puerto Rican immigrants. Immigrant women, and I thought this was really, really good. It's a view into a life so different from mine that I think it was definitely worth a read, and it's very short. So if just stories of immigrant women sound interesting to you, I think this is a very, very good choice of those stories. Next up, I read Grey Sister by Mark Lawrence, which is the second book of The Ancestor. The first one I think is called Red Sister. This series had a ton of hype a couple of years ago, but I think it's just okay. The first book was good, but the second book was kind of like, I just don't care anymore. So I think that if you can find this used somewhere, that it may be worth like picking up and grabbing. Like all three of the books in the series, or at least the first two. I haven't read the third one yet. But I don't think the first book is good enough for anybody to really pay full price for, but I don't think it's so bad that I would say if you are interested in it to avoid it. if that makes sense. It was okay. After that, I read How to Argue with a Racist by Matthew Rutherford. This is a scientific book about racism and genealogy. You're not actually going to get arguments to use in a racial debate, because anybody who's racist is going to be far too stupid to understand what you're trying to argue from this book. So if you're really, really into science and the science of genealogy and racism and how all of that is a load of bullshit, then I think you might like this. But if you're not really into science, this may not be for you. So just go into it aware that it's not actually arguments, it's just, this is what our genes say about race. Next up, I read The Gosmere Mage by Julie, oh god, I can't say that. I don't know how to say her last name. Anyway, this book I got in my sci-fi book club book box. And when I first read it, I gave it 4 stars, but then when I was going through this, I don't remember what happened in this book. So I moved it down to a 3 stars before I started recording and before I did all my stats. But this is one of those books where I enjoyed it while reading it, obviously, since I gave it a 4 star, but the story of this didn't really stick in my head. So enjoyable if you have it already, but not something that I would really say go out and purchase. But maybe if you find it used and the plot sounds really good, pick it up. Next up, I read The Wood by Chelsea Bobluski. I thought this was horror because it looks very horror-esque from the cover. It's not horror, this is fantasy, it's portal fantasy. It was okay, a bit too young for my personal taste, because this is young adult. But yeah, the cover's misleading, but if you're looking for portal fantasy, then you might like this, because I didn't hate this, it just wasn't what I was expecting from the cover. Next up, I read The Library of Mount Char by Scott Hawkins. This book I read as part of my long-standing quest to find weird books with unlikable female characters. This one was okay, but not great. I did like this, but it wasn't like 5 stars. So this is like 4 stars. I liked the story. It was the right kind of weird, the right kind of unlikable female character. There was just something missing that I can't really explain. I seem, from what I've had, or what I've read of like this specific subgenre, I don't even know if it's a subgenre, it's a subgenre in my mind, but from what I've read, I find that I tend to like books in this subgenre written by women and not as much books written by men. And that just could be what I've found so far. I just haven't found the right male author for this subgenre. So if you know of books that are weird with unlikable female characters, leave them in the comments below, because that is my jam. After that, I read The Calculating Stars by Mary Robinette Kowal. I really liked this and I didn't expect to. I thought this was going to be too smart for me, but it's not. If you like the idea of a physicist, astronaut, woman in the 1950s and alternate history, I highly, highly recommend this series. This is so outstandingly good so far. I mean, this is the first book, but I'm already started the second book because this one sounds so this one was so freaking good. After that, I finally got around to reading Severance by Ling Ma, and I did not like this at all. This was so boring, but I think the purpose of this book was to be boring. It's entirely about routine, and it's got like a zombie vibe plus a pandemic vibe, but somehow Ling Ma managed to make zombies and pandemics the most boring thing I've ever read. But like I said, it's supposed to be boring. So if you're into like a slow, well-written literary type story and you're not looking for a bunch of action, you may like this. After that, I read A Discovery of Witches by Deborah Harkness. I buddy read this with my author friend Deidre Dake, and neither one of us liked it, but for different reasons. Basically, in my opinion, if you want Twilight but 30-year-olds, then read this. If you think the love story in Twilight was entirely fucking creepy, then probably don't read this. This is the first book in the All Souls trilogy, and I do not plan to finish this trilogy. I'm out. I'm done. After that, we have a thick book, and that is Saga Compendium 1. This is the first 9 volumes of the Saga graphic novel, and I love this. This is absolutely fantastic. Highly recommend, but you have to go into this knowing that the content of this is very graphic as far as full frontal nudity. You see a lot of dicks and vaginas. There's very intense graphic language and a lot of like murder and stuff like that. But if all of those things are okay with you, please read Saga. This is so freaking good. After that, I read Girls with Razor Hearts by Suzanne Young. This is the second book in the Girls with Sharp Sticks series. I don't like anything else that Suzanne Young has really written. I've had some very bad experiences with her writing, but this series so far is really good. Even if it is a little bit overdone, but this is a very feminist story. It's not subtle. The misogyny in this story is not subtle even a little bit. So if you want feminist and you want in your face feminism with a sci-fi twist, you might like this. This is also young adult, so you've got to be willing to read young adult. After that, I read The Marionettes by Kate Wismere. Kate is a YouTuber, and this was available on Kindle Unlimited, so I picked it up for free because I had a couple of extra days of the month, and I was just like, I don't know what I'm gonna read. Let's read this. This was good. Like, this was pretty good. It's vampires and witches, and I read a lot of vampires and witches for absolutely no reason this month. I had like themes, like vampires and witches and feminism and yeah, just vampires and witches and feminism seemed to be my themes this month on complete accident. Half the books that I read with those subjects, I didn't even know had those subjects going into it. But this one I actually think is really, really good. And like I said, it's available on Kindle Unlimited if you're interested in it and you have a Kindle Unlimited subscription. I liked it. I will say that there's a huge cliffhanger at the end, so maybe if you hate cliffhangers, wait until either the second book comes out or maybe the whole series comes out before you read this one, because you get a lot of questions but absolutely no answers. I know she's finished with the second book, and I think it's supposed to come out in December, so it's not like a huge wait or anything like that. But I enjoyed it. I don't care about cliffhangers, and I'm fine with waiting. From there, let's go into the 2 books that I did DNF. First off was Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. The main character in this story is like a human rug, and she just happily allows everybody around her to just walk all over her and refuses to stand up for herself, and I hate it. Like, I just didn't want to read from her perspective anymore. And the language of this is just so overbearing. I have never in my life read the word rhododendron more than I have in this book. So I was done with this. I went and looked up the cliff notes. The plot of this story I could fit into like 50 pages, and the rest of it just seems to be filler. I know a lot of people like this. This just isn't for me. Just not my writing style. Don't like the main character. Just, I'm out. The other book that I DNF'd was Early Riser by Jasper Fforde. This one I did get in my sci-fi book box, but like a couple of months ago, not recently. I thought the premise of this sounded so cool, but I hated the story, or I hated it enough to DNF it. So basically what I didn't like about this story is the world building is so complicated in here that you really have no earthly idea what's going on. It's like English, but there's all this like slang and made up stuff that isn't explained at all. And I'm not, like 100 pages in, I didn't have enough interest in what was going on with the book to continue to try fighting to figure out what the fuck was going on in this book. So, but the premise sounded so good, so I'm very disappointed, but I just couldn't be bothered to finish this, and I've got better things to do with my time than read books that I don't like. The last book that I read this month, I do want to take a little bit more time to actually talk about because I have a lot to say. And I got this as a NetGalley arc, and it's Empire of the Vampire by Jay Kristoff, which comes out in mid-September. Now, I requested the arc of it, but what they gave me was a sampler. The sampler has over 400 pages though, so it's a huge chunk of a book. The actual book has like 700 something pages. So while I did complete the entirety of the sampler, what I read in the sampler doesn't give me the desire to purchase the full book. So it's a DNF of the full book, but I did complete it, and I put it on my wrap-up because I did complete everything that I had of this book. So from what I'm seeing of reviews so far, a lot of people really seem to like this book, like people who got early copies of it. I didn't, if you can't tell by the fact that I'm not going to purchase the full book. Now, Jay Kristoff himself seems to be a really shitty human being and not somebody that I really want to support. I did request this arc because I knew he was a shitty human being, but I also figured that this is probably going to be in the fantasy category for Goodreads Choice, which I read every year. So I didn't want to monetarily support him, but I also don't want to not read things on the Goodreads Choice. So ARC seemed to be the way to go with that. And I'm glad I got approved of it, and I'm glad I got to give this a chance. Jay Kristoff in the past has been accused of sexualizing children a lot and cultural appropriation. And the sexualization of children does continue in this series, as well as appropriation, though necessarily not cultural appropriation, which I'll explain in a little bit. When he's been called out on this on the past, he's made like snide comments and just instead of like learning and thinking about the shit that he does and being a better person, he's just like, people are so sensitive. And it's like, no, people aren't sensitive. You're an asshole, dude. So not really somebody that I want to support, though I'm not going to say that you can't support him if you really like his work. Like that's on you, that's not on me. And if you want more information about like the bullshit that he's pulled in the past, please look him up yourself. Don't just take my word for it. So, there are good things about this book. The artwork in this book is gorgeous. There's like all these illustrations, fantastic. The format is like a story within a story, very similar to The Name of the Wind by Pathfinder Rothfuss, where somebody who's like retired or an older man is telling somebody else his story about like how he saved or ruined the world or whatever. So that I like that storytelling device. There are a couple of like extremely funny one-liners throughout here, and all of that is good. What I did not like was this is a very heavily religious story, and it's just not my personal thing. Like, it doesn't bother most people. I just don't like religious stories. As far as when I said appropriation, this is where this feels like icky to me, where Jay Kristoff is very obviously taking other people's stories and just pulling them into his own. You have like the storytelling device of Name of the Wind, where it's very, very similar. You have the Bible, like a lot of this is pulled like directly from the Bible and just given a different name. But it's very, 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 very much just the Bible. Which, okay, people steal that all the time, not that big of a deal. And there are just plot points from other stories. Blade, that's another one, where the main character is literally Blade. Like, the main character of this book is Blade. If you've seen the Blade movies, that is your main character. All of those are kind of like, you could be inspired, and he's done enough changes that it's like, okay, he's inspired by these other authors. It's okay. It's not, it feels kind of icky, but it's not like gratuitous, just copyright theft. But it's a little too much of stealing other people's stories for my comfort. The one that does not feel like it's inspired by, there is a scene at the end of the sampler, so probably a little over halfway through the actual book, that is almost word for word just copied from Stephen King's Salem's Lot. Like, this exact scene happened in Salem's Lot. And I'm reading it and I'm going, I've seen this before, and I had to think about it for a little bit, but it is exactly the scene from Salem's Lot. The other thing that he does that made me very uncomfortable reading it is there is a lot of unnecessary pedophilia in this book. For some reason, the bad guy, or one of the bad guys, there's vampires, so all the vampires are bad guys, but one of the vampires is very into young girls, and I get that being a pedophilia is equated with evil. So, okay, it's a way to make this character very evil. I don't like it, but you know what, I can understand it to an extent. My problem with it is Jay Kristoff has been called out for including pedophilia in his books prior to this series, and people have told him that he's uncomfortable with, or that they're uncomfortable with how he does this, but he's continuing to do it even though he's been told, like, hey, maybe back off on this, and so he like goes hard on it in this book instead, which feels very disrespectful and just extra icky. The other thing that he does is, like, there's a relationship in this book where one character is like 19, 20 and the other is 14. And these are the good guys. And it's like, why? Why is this necessary? You can either age up the 14-year-old, you can age down the 20-year-old, or just the relationship didn't seem necessary in what I had read of it. Like, maybe it's necessary and it just, I didn't get that far in the book, but any of those options would have been fine. It just didn't seem necessary, and it was just like, why? Like, why is this in your story? It's not needed, and it's gross. A 14-year-old, in my opinion, should not be having any sort of sexual relationship. The other thing that kind of we're off to the side, where it's like it's not the worst thing in the world, the writing's very pretentious. It didn't really bother me, but it was pretty fucking pretentious. Also, there is a lot of sexualizing things that don't necessarily need to be sexualized, in my opinion. I read tons of things that don't need to be sexualized that are. So this isn't like the worst thing in the world, but it didn't like overtly bother me. It wouldn't be something where it's like that is the reason that I wouldn't continue with the book, but I know it does bother a lot of people to have unnecessarily sexualization of things. So that just be aware of that if that is something that bothers you. I don't like it. But if you're a big fan of J. Kristoff and none of that stuff bothers you, you know what? You can do whatever the hell you want to do. It is your life, and live it in a way that makes you happy. Anyway, that is this video. Let me know down in the comments if you've either decided to read any of these books based off of what I've said, or you've decided that you're not going to read any of these books based off of what I said. And if you enjoyed this, please give me a thumbs up. I would appreciate this. And if you want to see more of what I read and you don't subscribe, hit that subscribe button. I will see you in the next video. Bye!